Theron Loxley adjusted his rearview mirror, taking in the dense, shadowed woods lining the narrow road. His car, a rental with just enough grit to handle the rough terrain, bumped along as the town came into view through the trees. Eldermore was no bustling town center or suburban oasis. It was quiet, secluded, a place that seemed untouched by time. Mist clung to the ground, creeping through the towering pines like ghostly fingers. This wasn't the kind of place that welcomed outsiders, and as he neared the town's first weathered houses, he felt its chilly embrace tightening around him. Theron reached into his coat pocket, retrieving a worn photograph of Zephyrah Ravenswood. The black and white image showed a beautiful young woman, her delicate smile almost mocking in its innocence. Her fiancé had handed him the picture just days ago, his hands shaking as he recounted the day she disappeared. Just vanished, the man had whispered, unable to meet Theron's eyes. The Ravenswoods won't say a word. It's like she never existed. The Ravenswoods. Even in passing, the name carried weight. Theron pocketed the photograph, glancing down at his case notes. Powerful family, wealthiest in Eldermore. Town practically belongs to them. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself. His cases rarely took him this far from the city, let alone into the woods surrounding such a town. But this was no ordinary investigation. Zephyrah's fiancé had paid him handsomely and was willing to cover all expenses for as long as it took. Theron, having solved cold cases others had given up on, knew that whatever Eldermore was hiding, he'd be the one to uncover it. Driving into the town square, Theron felt the eyes on him almost immediately. Townsfolk lingered by the shop windows, their conversations stilled as he stepped out of the car. The town had an old-world charm. Cobbled streets wound between modest, weathered shops, and the air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. A heavy silence hung around him, broken only by the occasional crow's call echoing from somewhere in the trees. A middle-aged man sweeping the sidewalk eyed him cautiously. When Theron nodded a greeting, the man stiffened, clutching his broom as though it were a shield. Another woman hurried her child inside a nearby shop, casting a wary glance over her shoulder. Theron noted every reaction, each one feeding his growing sense of unease. His footsteps echoed as he approached the town's only inn, the Silver Pine, an establishment that had seen better days. He pushed open the door, greeted by the smell of old wood and smoke from a crackling fireplace. Behind the counter stood a short, stout woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Afternoon," she greeted, her voice clipped and suspicious. "You don't look like you're from around here." "Just passing through," Theron replied, adopting a casual tone. "Looking for a place to stay for a while." Her eyes narrowed. "You'll find Eldermore's not much for visitors." "That's fine by me." He reached for his wallet, handing over a neatly folded bill. "Just looking for some peace and quiet." She considered him a moment longer before taking the money and sliding a key across the counter. "Room's at the end of the hall, and remember, folks around here mind their own business." He nodded, pocketing the key. As he turned away, she added quietly, almost as an afterthought, "And they'd appreciate if you did the same." Theron's instincts sharpened. Eldermore, he thought, was a town layered in secrets. But secrets had a way of slipping through cracks, and he intended to find every one. After settling in, Theron decided to explore. The late afternoon sun dipped behind dark clouds, casting the town in murky shadows. He wandered past the closed shops, his gaze taking in every detail: the faded signs, the boarded-up windows on the old library, the chipped paint on the town hall. Eldermore was aging, worn by the weight of time and silence. As he walked toward the edge of town, he heard voices, a hushed conversation drifting from a nearby alley. Curiosity tugged at him, and he slipped into the shadows, careful not to draw attention. Two men stood close, their voices a low murmur. "They're saying another's gone missing," one whispered, casting a nervous glance over his shoulder. "It's the Ravenswoods, I swear it." The other man shook his head, gripping his hat in trembling hands. "Keep your voice down, they'll hear you." "Who'll hear me?" the first man scoffed, though his voice wavered. "Them? Let 'em. This town's cursed because of them, and everyone knows it." Theron took in their words, his pulse quickening. The Ravenswoods were more than a wealthy family. They were a looming presence, like the fog that swallowed Eldermore each night. And their influence was built on fear. He waited until the men left before stepping back onto the main street, making a mental note of their conversation. If the townsfolk were this afraid to speak openly, there was more to the Ravenswoods than old money and land. He would have to be careful, but he felt the thrill of the hunt ignite within him. Secrets buried this deep were exactly why he'd taken the case. As the nightfall settled over Eldermore, casting long shadows through his room at the Silver Pine, Theron spread his notes across the small desk, Zephyra's photograph lying at the center. She looked young, maybe 21 or 22, and yet her disappearance had been met with silence, a lack of any official investigation, a convenience he found unsettling. His train of thought was interrupted by a knock on the door. Theron opened it to find the innkeeper's stoic face. "Dinner's ready," she muttered, eyeing the papers on his desk. "You'll want to join before the food's gone cold." "Thank you." Theron nodded, pocketing Zephyra's photograph as he followed her down the creaky staircase. The dining area was modest, with only a handful of tables. He took a seat near the back, observing as the townsfolk trickled in, each casting sidelong glances his way. He sensed their unease, but he noticed something else, a kind of reverence, a careful deference among them, as if they all shared an unspoken bond, bound by the same fear. Across the room, a young woman entered, her gaze drifting over him. She was striking, with pale skin and dark hair framing a solemn face. She sat alone, and when their eyes met, she gave a subtle nod. He'd seen enough in his line of work to recognize an ally when he saw one. After finishing his meal, Theron approached her table. "Mind if I join you?" She inclined her head slightly. "You must be the newcomer," she said, her voice low but steady. "What brings you to Eldermore?" "Curiosity," he replied, mirroring her tone. "And a missing person case." A flicker of emotion crossed her face before she composed herself. "Be careful, people don't come here to be found." He felt the weight of her words, the warning laced within them. Her eyes held a haunted look, as though she had seen the dark side of Eldermore up close. Before he could ask more, she rose and left, her figure disappearing into the mist outside. As Theron watched her leave, he knew he'd found his first link, a thread in the web surrounding Zephyra's disappearance. The Ravenswood name was more than just influential. It was a shadow, a shroud that covered Eldermore. And the more he pulled at it, the more tangled he would become. Returning to his room, Theron heard a faint scratching at his door. He opened it cautiously, finding a folded slip of paper lying just outside. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "Leave before it's too late. They see everything." Theron pocketed the note, feeling his resolve harden. Fear could be a powerful tool, but it could also expose those who wielded it. Whoever had left the note feared the Ravenswoods deeply enough to reach out, yet lacked the courage to face them directly. As he lay in bed that night, sleep eluded him. His mind churned with possibilities, tracing each whispered word, each frightened look, each warning that Eldermore wasn't just any small town. It was a place where history and darkness walked hand in hand, and the Ravenswoods were its keepers. Tomorrow, he decided, he would make his way to the Ravenswood estate. If they truly saw everything, then it was time they saw him coming. He was here to uncover Zephyra's fate, and no shadows, no matter how deep, would keep him from his path. Theron Locksley arrived at the Ravenswood estate just after sunrise, the early light casting eerie shadows across the sprawling mansion and its surrounding gardens. The estate loomed, a fortress nestled in the woods, its tall iron gates closed and flanked by towering stone pillars. The winding gravel path leading up to the main house was lined with trees, their twisted branches seeming to reach out like skeletal fingers. At the gate, Theron pressed the small brass button on the intercom. A few moments passed before a crackling voice responded, cold and clipped. "Who is it?" "Theron Locksley," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "I'm here to speak with the Ravenswood family." There was a pause before the gate slowly groaned open. Theron's instincts flared. The family's willingness to let him in suggested they either underestimated him or were prepared for his visit. As he walked up the path, he felt the weight of countless unseen eyes watching him from the manor's windows. His hand brushed against the old photograph of Zephyra in his pocket. He reminded himself why he was here, to uncover what had happened to her, to break through the walls the Ravenswoods had built around their secrets. Inside, the Ravenswood estate was even more imposing than it appeared from the outside. The foyer opened up into a grand hall decorated with dark, polished wood and somber paintings of long-dead Ravenswood ancestors. A crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting an icy glow that did little to warm the cold air. "Mr. Locksley," a deep, measured voice called. Theron turned to see Alaric Ravenswood, the family patriarch, descending a sweeping staircase. Alaric was a tall, imposing man with graying hair slicked back and sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through Theron. He exuded an air of authority, every step deliberate, as though he were fully aware of the weight his name carried. "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Ravenswood," Theron said, extending his hand. Alaric regarded it coolly for a moment before giving it a brief, firm shake. "We don't often entertain outsiders," Alaric said, a slight sneer in his voice. "But I understand you're here about my daughter, Zephyra." "That's correct," Theron replied. "I was hired by her fiancé to look into her disappearance." Alaric's eyes narrowed, the corners of his mouth tightening. "A tragedy indeed, but I fail to see how reopening old wounds benefits anyone. Zephyra has been gone for over a year now." Theron met Alaric's gaze, unflinching. "People don't simply vanish, Mr. Ravenswood, not without a trace." Alaric's expression remained impassive, though a flicker of something, perhaps anger or resentment, flickered across his face. "I assure you, Mr. Locksley, the Ravenswood family has nothing to hide." Theron nodded, though he could feel the tension thickening between them. "I'd appreciate your cooperation in answering a few questions. I'd like to understand Zephyra's life here, her routines, her relationships." Alaric gave a curt nod. "Very well, but I warn you, Mr. Locksley, there are boundaries you would be wise not to cross." Alaric led Theron to the Ravenswood sitting room, a grand space lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and heavy, ornate furniture. The room was empty, save for two figures seated near the window. Celine Ravenswood, Alaric's wife, and Cassius Ravenswood, their eldest son. Celine was a slender woman with an austere elegance, her jet-black hair swept back from her face. Her gaze was distant, unfocused, as though she were staring into some unseen world beyond the window. Cassius, in contrast, was younger and sharper, his intense gaze fixed directly on Theron with an unnerving intensity. "This is Mr. Locksley," Alaric announced. "He's looking into Zephyra's disappearance." Cassius's lips curled into a smirk. "Is that so?" he drawled, his voice laced with disdain. "I wasn't aware she was missing." "Cassius," Celine murmured, her voice soft and almost dreamlike. "Show some respect." Theron studied them carefully. There was a palpable tension between mother and son, as though a long-standing resentment simmered beneath the surface. The family dynamics, he noted, were complex, with each member seemingly bound by silent rules and unspoken grudges. "I appreciate your cooperation," Theron said, focusing on Celine. "Can you tell me about the last time you saw Zephyra?" Celine's gaze sharpened, her expression shifting from vacant to guarded. "It was a year ago," she said slowly, as if choosing each word with care. "She was troubled, restless. She'd been speaking of leaving Eldermore." "Leaving?" Theron raised an eyebrow. "Do you know why?" She wanted a life of her own," Celine replied, glancing briefly at Alaric. "But she belonged here. The Ravenswood blood is tied to Eldermore, as it has been for generations." "Blood is all we have," Alaric said, his voice carrying a finality that silenced the room. "We are Ravenswoods, and we do not abandon our own." The words hung in the air like a dark omen, and Theron sensed that Zephyra's desire to leave had not been well received. He made a mental note of the tension, certain that the family's loyalty to its name and legacy held a clue to Zephyra's fate. As the conversation wound down, Alaric rose and led Theron back toward the entrance. Along the way, they passed a corridor branching off into dimly lit rooms, their doors closed and marked with intricate symbols carved into the wood. Theron slowed, glancing down the corridor. "What's down there?" Alaric's expression darkened. "Private family quarters. They are not to be disturbed." Theron nodded, though his curiosity burned. The symbols on the doors were ancient, each one unique, and they seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly energy. He could sense that whatever lay behind those doors held secrets that went beyond Zephyra's disappearance. As they neared the main door, Alaric fixed Theron with a warning look. "I understand you are a man of persistence, Mr. Locksley, but Eldermore and the Ravenswoods have traditions, boundaries. I strongly advise that you respect them." Theron's lips curved into a polite smile. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Ravenswood. I'll be sure to keep that in mind." As he left the estate, Theron knew that he had barely scratched the surface of the Ravenswood family's secrets. There was something hidden within those walls, something far darker than he had anticipated. And if he was going to uncover what had happened to Zephyra, he would have to be willing to cross boundaries and break through the walls Alaric had so carefully constructed. As Theron stepped out of the Ravenswood estate, he felt a prickle on the back of his neck. He turned, scanning the second-floor windows, and saw a figure watching him from behind a curtain. A young woman with pale skin and dark hair. She met his gaze for an instant before disappearing from view. The sight left him unsettled. He had met Celine and Cassius, but this woman didn't match the descriptions of any other family members he had been told about. She could be a servant, perhaps, or another relative. Either way, her presence only deepened the mystery surrounding the estate. Theron's thoughts raced as he made his way back to the Silver Pine. The Ravenswoods were guarding secrets, ancient and dark, and there was someone else within those walls. Someone who knew more than they let on. That night, as he reviewed his notes, Theron wrote down the questions swirling in his mind. Who was the woman in the window? And what lay behind those forbidden doors with their strange symbols? His investigation had only just begun, but he could feel the chill of the Ravenswood's secrets creeping over him like the fog that blanketed Eldermoor. The morning fog lay thick over Eldermoor as Theron walked through the town square, making his way toward the local cafe. He intended to learn more about the Ravenswoods from the townsfolk, preferably someone unconnected to the family. The cafe was a small, dimly lit place with creaky wooden floors and only a few tables scattered across the room. As he entered, conversations fell silent and he felt every eye on him. Theron took a seat at the counter, ordered a black coffee, and waited, feigning casual disinterest. Slowly, conversations resumed around him, though he could still feel the guarded glances. Moments later, the cafe door swung open, and a wiry man with sunken eyes took a seat beside him. He glanced sideways at Theron as if sizing him up. Theron saw his chance. "Morning," he greeted, nodding politely. "I'm new in town." The man chuckled dryly, his gaze shifting. "That obvious, huh?" "Just passing through," Theron replied, looking into some local history. The man stiffened, casting a wary glance around before speaking in a low voice. "Be careful asking about the Ravenswoods. They don't take kindly to strangers poking around." Theron leaned in, his tone equally quiet. "So I've been told. But it seems there's more to their story than anyone's willing to share." The man hesitated, then whispered, "If you value your life, keep away from them. People disappear around here. Have for years. And it's always brushed under the rug." With that, the man stood, tossing a few coins on the counter before hurrying out. Theron watched him go, his words echoing ominously. The fear surrounding the Ravenswoods ran deeper than he had realized, a fear that silenced even the most talkative. Leaving the cafe, Theron headed to the small Eldermoor Public Library, a squat building that looked as ancient as the town itself. Inside, he was greeted by the faint, musty smell of aging paper. He approached the librarian, a stern-looking woman with thick glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. "Good morning," he said. "I'm hoping to look through any historical records you might have on Eldermoor." The librarian eyed him suspiciously. "What's your interest?" "Just a research project," he said smoothly. "I'm interested in the history of local families, especially the Ravenswoods." The mention of the name caused her to pale, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her glasses. "The Ravenswoods are private folk. Not much is documented about them." Theron pressed on. "Any records at all? Anything that could give insight into their influence over the town?" After a tense moment, she nodded reluctantly, leading him to a dimly lit corner of the library where dusty volumes sat untouched. She selected a small, leather-bound book with faded gold letters on the cover. "Chronicles of Eldermoor." "This has some history about the town's early families," she whispered, casting a nervous glance around. "But be warned, Mr. Locksley, some things are better left undisturbed." Theron thanked her, and as he flipped through the pages, the history of the Ravenswoods began to unravel. They had arrived in Eldermoor centuries ago, claiming land and consolidating power through means that were vaguely alluded to: alliances, mysterious disappearances, and rumored pacts with shadowy forces. One passage caught his eye. The Ravenswoods are a family bound by blood, their ties to Eldermoor written in darkness and sacrifice. Each generation is sworn to protect the town, and in return, they are promised a power that binds them. Theron copied the passage into his notebook, realizing that Zephyrah's disappearance might only be one of many sacrifices made by the family. The Ravenswoods were more than influential. They seemed entangled with something otherworldly that kept the town and its people under their control. Theron left the library with a sense of purpose. His search led him to the edge of town, where he was directed to an elderly woman named Idalia Everhart, who had lived in Eldermoor her entire life. He found her small, weathered cottage surrounded by untamed gardens, her front door slightly ajar. Inside, the dimly lit room was filled with an assortment of old trinkets and relics, giving it the feeling of a time capsule. Idalia sat in an armchair by the fireplace, her eyes fixed on him as he approached. Her gaze was sharp, calculating. "You're the one asking about the Ravenswoods," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "A dangerous path to walk, boy." Theron took a seat across from her, nodding. "I'm investigating Zephyr Ravenswood's disappearance. I believe the family may be hiding something." Idalia's mouth twisted into a bitter smile. "Hiding? The Ravenswoods are steeped in secrets older than this town itself. Zephyr was one of many who vanished under their roof." "Many?" Theron's pulse quickened. "Do you mean other family members?" She shook her head slowly. "Not just family. Townsfolk, drifters, those who dared to defy them. They say the Ravenswoods' power is bound to the land, their legacy upheld through blood. But mark my words, meddling with their affairs will only lead to grief." "Do you know what happened to Zephyrah?" Idalia's face softened, a trace of sorrow in her eyes. "The poor girl. I saw her the night she disappeared. She came to me, desperate to leave Eldermoor, saying she'd seen things at the estate. Things that chilled her to the bone." Theron leaned forward, his voice a whisper. "And then? She left, vowing never to return. But the Ravenswoods, they always get what they want. And what they wanted, I suspect, was her silence." Idalia's words sank deep into his mind. Zephyrah hadn't simply vanished, she'd been silenced, like so many before her. Theron knew he was on the right track, though it left him more unsettled than ever. Returning to town, Theron stopped by the general store, hoping to overhear any more rumors about the Ravenswoods. Inside, he noticed a small group of townsfolk huddled near the counter, speaking in hushed voices. As he approached, their conversation ceased, and they exchanged wary glances. One man, Calix Penrose, a thin, nervous-looking figure, eventually turned to him. "You're the investigator, right? The one looking into Zephyrah?" Theron nodded. "I am. Do you know anything?" Calix shifted uneasily, glancing toward the door as if to ensure they weren't overheard. "People here don't talk about the Ravenswoods. Not openly. But strange things happen when they're involved. There was a boy who went missing 5 years ago, and a woman before that from the next town over. Both times the Ravenswoods' name came up." A woman standing beside him nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "They're cursed, that family. They say the forest itself listens to them, that they can make things disappear." Theron studied their faces, each one lined with worry and fear. "If that's true, why do you stay?" The woman's voice trembled. "Because Eldermoor isn't just a town, it's a trap. Those who try to leave don't make it far, and those who speak up end up gone." Theron absorbed their words, his resolve hardening. The Ravenswoods were far more than just a powerful family. They had a stranglehold on this town, keeping its secrets buried under layers of fear. If he was going to get to the bottom of this, he would need to push deeper, into territory that others dared not tread. That evening, Theron sat in his room at the Silver Pine, combing through his notes. Each piece of information painted a dark portrait of Eldermoor's history, of the Ravenswoods' role in its underbelly. He thought back to Idalia's words. The Ravenswoods always get what they want. He took out the photograph of Zephyrah again, her smiling face now seeming distant and unreachable. He wondered how long she had known about her family's legacy, whether she had tried to defy it, and if her attempts to leave had cost her life. As he read over his notes, Theron felt the weight of what he was uncovering. The Ravenswoods weren't just protectors of Eldermoor. They were its curse. Every disappearance, every whispered rumor, every warning told him the same story. This was a family that controlled more than wealth and power. They commanded loyalty through fear, and their influence extended far beyond the town's borders. The night deepened, shadows creeping across the room as Theron prepared himself for the next step. Tomorrow, he would return to the estate, pushing further to find any trace of Zephyra. But he knew now that his task wasn't just about solving a disappearance. It was about dismantling the Ravenswood's legacy piece by piece, and in doing so, he would confront forces far darker than he had anticipated. The next morning, Theron returned to the Eldermore Library, determined to uncover anything the town's records might reveal about the Ravenswood's influence over the years. The library was silent, save for the occasional creak of old wood underfoot, and the librarian watched him warily from her desk as he approached. "I need more information," he said quietly. "Particularly anything that mentions the Ravenswoods and any unusual incidents in town." The librarian hesitated before nodding and leading him to the back room. She unlocked a heavy door, revealing a storage room filled with dusty, leather-bound books and ancient documents. "The town records are here," she said in a hushed tone. "But be cautious with what you find. The Ravenswoods don't take kindly to prying." Theron assured her of his discretion before setting to work, flipping through fragile pages that contained records dating back centuries. Among the records, he discovered cryptic mentions of Ravenswood family rituals and mysterious disappearances of townsfolk, all quietly filed away, as though Eldermore itself had conspired to keep the truth hidden. One record, a journal entry from over 100 years ago, caught his attention. It described a family ceremony held by the Ravenswoods in which the eldest daughter was offered as a guardian to the land, a term that left a chill in his bones. The phrase "ascendance ceremony" appeared repeatedly, hinting that this ceremony was a rite of passage for the family, a ritual that seemed to bind them to Eldermore. As he copied down the notes, Theron realized that Zephyra's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a dark legacy, a pattern that bound each generation of Ravenswood daughters to something ancient and malevolent. The more he learned, the more he suspected that Zephyra hadn't merely disappeared, but had been taken, claimed by the family's sinister traditions. Theron's next stop was the town's small, neglected cemetery, where generations of Ravenswoods were buried. The cemetery was a forgotten place, overgrown with ivy and shadowed by ancient oaks. He wandered the paths, reading the names on the weathered headstones, each bearing dates and symbols hinting at untimely deaths and enigmatic lives. One grave, in particular, drew his attention. Ophelia Ravenswood, who had died at the same age Zephyra would have been today. He knelt down to read the inscription, "For those who guard the shadows shall never fade." Theron's pulse quickened. Ophelia Ravenswood had died under mysterious circumstances, her grave a silent witness to whatever forces had claimed her. As he stood, he noticed several other graves, each bearing the names of young Ravenswood women who had died before their time, all around the age of 21, just as Zephyra had been. These women weren't merely family members, they were sacrifices, bound to Eldermore's dark secrets through blood. The realization tightened Theron's resolve. The Ravenswoods weren't merely influential. They were custodians of an ancient curse, one that had claimed Zephyra as its latest offering. Theron returned to his room at the Silver Pine, where he combed through his notes and organized his findings. The pieces began to fit together, forming a macabre puzzle of family loyalty, forbidden rites, and generational sacrifices. As he mapped out the family tree, he noted the unnerving number of Ravenswood women who had disappeared or died young. In his mind, he envisioned Zephyra trapped within this web, struggling to escape a fate dictated by her ancestors. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He opened it to find the librarian, who had come quietly and without warning. She looked anxious, her face pale. "There's something else," she whispered, pressing a small, leather-bound ledger into his hands. "I found it hidden among the town archives, as if someone didn't want it to be seen." Theron opened the ledger, its pages filled with meticulous records of dates, names, and cryptic notes. The names of each Ravenswood daughter were listed, followed by symbols that Theron recognized from the forbidden corridor he'd glimpsed at the Ravenswood estate. Each symbol seemed to signify a rite, a marking of some kind, with the final notation reading, Ascended. The most recent entry was Zephyrah's. Theron's heart pounded. This ledger was proof. Zephyrah's disappearance was no accident. She had been marked, selected for the Ascendance ceremony, an ancient ritual passed down through the Ravenswood bloodline. He had the evidence he needed to confront the family, to expose their secrets. But he also knew that any misstep could cost him his life. Armed with the ledger, Theron returned to Eldermoor's outskirts and sought out Idalia Everhard again. He needed answers, someone who could interpret the cryptic symbols and rituals mentioned in the ledger. She welcomed him in, her expression tense as he explained what he had discovered. Idalia's face grew pale as she examined the ledger, her fingers tracing the symbols with a trembling hand. This is ancient magic," she whispered. "The Ravenswoods have kept Eldermoor bound for centuries, feeding their power through the sacrifice of their daughters." "What does it mean by ascendance?" Theron asked, bracing himself for her answer. "Ascendance is a ritual that binds the chosen Ravenswood woman's spirit to Eldermoor," Idalia explained, her voice heavy with fear. "They believe it grants them control over the land, over the people. It keeps them in power. But the cost is her life. Zephyrah wasn't just a daughter to them, she was a sacrifice." The revelation sent a chill down Theron's spine. The Ravenswoods had claimed Zephyrah as the latest in a long line of sacrificial daughters, each bound to protect the family's control over Eldermoor. He now understood that the Ravenswoods would do anything to protect this dark tradition, even if it meant silencing him. Before he left, Idalia warned him, "If they suspect you know too much, they will try to stop you. Be wary, Mr. Locksley. The Ravenswoods may appear civilized, but they are more dangerous than you can imagine." Theron returned to his room, his mind racing with everything he'd learned. As he entered, he found a note slipped under his door. Unfolding it, he read the words scrawled in elegant, looping handwriting. "We know what you're looking for, Mr. Locksley. Tread carefully, or you may be the next one to disappear." He felt a jolt of fear, followed by a surge of defiance. The Ravenswoods were aware of his investigation, of his discoveries. This note was their way of reminding him of their power. But instead of deterring him, it only steeled his resolve. That night, Theron lay awake, fully aware that he was now in the crosshairs of a family willing to protect their secrets at any cost. He knew he couldn't turn back now. Zephyrah's life had been taken in the name of family loyalty, bound to a curse stretching back generations. He was the only one standing between the Ravenswoods and the continuation of their dark legacy. As he closed his eyes, he knew what he had to do next. He would confront Alaric Ravenswood directly, forcing him to answer for Zephyrah's disappearance and the twisted rituals that had claimed the lives of so many Ravenswood daughters. He was no longer just a detective. He was a man on a mission, determined to shatter the curse that bound Eldermoor to the Ravenswoods. Dark and bloody legacy. The following day, Theron made his way back to the Ravenswood estate. He felt the weight of the note he'd received, the words echoing in his mind as he approached the grand iron gates. The Ravenswoods knew he was closing in on their secrets, but he wasn't about to be intimidated. Alaric Ravenswood met him in the main hall, his expression severe, lips set in a grim line. Beside him stood his son, Cassius, arms folded and face twisted in disdain. The tension was palpable, the air thick with a quiet menace. "I trust you found Eldermoor enlightening, Mr. Locksley," Alaric said, his voice as icy as ever. Theron didn't flinch. "Enlightening, yes. Troubling, more so. I know about the Ascendance ceremony, Mr. Ravenswood. I know what you did to Zephyrah." Alaric's gaze hardened, while Cassius's lip curled into a smirk. "Be careful, detective," Cassius sneered. "Accusations without proof can be dangerous." "I have more than enough proof," Theron replied, holding up the ledger he had obtained from the archives. "The entire history of your family's rituals is right here. Generations of Ravenswood daughters offered as sacrifices to protect your power." Alaric's eyes flickered with something close to anger, but he maintained his composure. "You misunderstand, Mr. Locksley. The Ravenswoods do what must be done to protect Eldermoor. Our family has served this town for centuries, and sacrifices must be made for the greater good." Theron's voice rose. "And Zephyrah's disappearance, was that part of the greater good? Was she sacrificed just to maintain your stranglehold on this town? Alaric stepped forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You're meddling in matters beyond your comprehension, detective. Eldermore is bound to us. Interfere, and you will only bring ruin upon yourself. The threat hung heavy in the air, but Theron held his ground. He knew the Ravenswoods weren't bluffing. They were used to getting their way, eliminating threats before they could expose the truth. But he was no ordinary investigator, and he wouldn't back down now. Leaving the estate, Theron felt the adrenaline still coursing through him. The confrontation had shaken him, but it had also solidified his resolve. The Ravenswoods were ruthless, yes, but they had revealed their fear of losing control, fear of exposure. As he walked back into town, the fog began to thicken, swirling around him until he could barely see the path ahead. Shadows loomed in the mist, creating shapes that seemed to dance and flicker. A chill ran down his spine, and his hand instinctively moved to his pocket, where he kept his flashlight. Suddenly, something shifted in the fog, a faint rustling sound that seemed to come from every direction at once. Theron slowed, his instincts on high alert, his every sense attuned to his surroundings. A shadow moved, darting toward him with unnatural speed. He barely had time to react, dodging just as a figure lunged from the mist, swinging something heavy. Theron stumbled backward, regaining his balance in time to see two figures, their faces obscured by the fog, closing in on him. He recognized the intent in their movements. They were here to silence him, to protect the Ravenswood secrets at any cost. He fought back, managing to land a punch on one of them, but the other swung a blunt object, striking his shoulder. Pain shot through him, but he pushed forward, ducking and weaving to avoid their blows. His mind raced, assessing his options. They were trying to drive him further into the fog, into the cover of the forest. Just as he was beginning to feel overwhelmed, a piercing whistle echoed through the mist, startling his attackers. The two figures hesitated, then disappeared into the fog as suddenly as they'd appeared. Theron was left standing alone, his breath ragged, his body aching from the scuffle. He knew then that the Ravenswoods were willing to use any means necessary to stop him. This wasn't just a warning, it was an attempt to eliminate him entirely. Shaken but undeterred, Theron backed to the Silver Pine, where he was surprised to find Leora Blackthorn, the woman who had once hinted at her family's past with the Ravenswoods, waiting for him in the lobby. She looked nervous, casting wary glances over her shoulder. "I heard about what happened," she whispered, ushering him into a quiet corner. "You need to leave Eldermore. They'll stop at nothing." Theron shook his head. "I can't leave, not until I know what happened to Zephyra. The Ravenswoods are hiding something dark, and I intend to expose it." Leora hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I know they are. My family has lived in Eldermore for generations, always under the Ravenswood's shadow. My brother tried to escape, but he disappeared." "What do you know about the Ascendance ceremony?" Theron asked, sensing that Leora knew more than she let on. She bit her lip, glancing around nervously. "I don't know everything, but I've heard stories, whispers about sacrifices, about rituals meant to bind the family to the land. My grandmother told me once that the Ravenswoods are bound to Eldermore in ways we can't understand. They believe their sacrifices give them power, that without it, the town would suffer." Theron absorbed her words, realizing that Leora's family had been just as haunted by the Ravenswoods as others he'd spoken to. She was a link, a possible ally in his quest for truth, and he knew he'd need her help to continue. "If you want to help," he said, "I need access to the Ravenswood estate. There's a corridor there, one that leads to forbidden rooms. I think that's where they conduct their rituals." Leora hesitated, then nodded. "I can help, but you'll be on your own once inside, and if you're caught, I can't protect you." Theron nodded, his determination renewed. He was willing to take the risk, even if it meant venturing into the heart of the Ravenswood secrets. Late that night, with Leora's help, Theron slipped past the estate gates and entered the Ravenswood mansion. The house was quiet, shrouded in darkness. Save for the faint glow of candlelight flickering from the forbidden corridor he'd glimpsed on his last visit. Moving stealthily, he approached the corridor, his flashlight illuminating the carved symbols on the doors, symbols he recognized from the ledger. Each door was marked with the name of a Ravenswood daughter, each one an offering in the family's dark legacy. He paused at a door bearing the name Ophelia Ravenswood, the young woman whose grave he had visited in the cemetery. The carvings seemed to pulse with a strange energy, almost as if the spirit of the girl lingered, trapped within. Theron pushed open the door, revealing a small, dimly lit chamber filled with ritualistic items, candles, bones, and ancient texts. He approached a wooden table in the center of the room, where a large, leather-bound tome lay open. The page bore intricate sketches and descriptions of the ascendance ceremony, outlining each step of the ritual and the offering required. His heart pounded as he read the words, confirming his worst fears. Zephyra had been intended as an offering to complete the ceremony, to bind her spirit to Eldermore and secure the Ravenswood's control over the land. Footsteps echoed in the corridor, and Theron quickly hid behind a large armoire, clutching the tome. He held his breath, peering out as Alaric entered the room, his face grim. Behind him stood Cassius, his expression one of twisted delight as he scanned the room. "They know too much, Father," Cassius muttered, his eyes glinting. "We should finish it tonight." Alaric nodded solemnly, his voice low and resolute. "The ceremony must be completed. If the girl's fiancé suspects anything, we'll deal with him too. And if this detective gets in our way, well, he'll join her." Theron's blood ran cold. They were planning another sacrifice, another ritual to secure their power. Zephyra's fiancé, and perhaps even he himself, were now marked targets. Silently, he slipped from the room, taking the tome with him as he retreated back into the shadows. Theron managed to exit the estate undetected, his mind racing with everything he'd uncovered. He now had irrefutable proof of the Ravenswood's dark legacy, but the stakes had risen. They were planning to complete another ceremony, and he knew he had little time to stop them. He reached his room at the Silver Pine just before dawn, locking the door behind him. Exhausted but determined, he studied the tome he had taken from the estate, scanning its pages for any details that could help him dismantle the ritual. He knew he would need to act fast, but he also needed a plan, one that would expose the Ravenswoods without jeopardizing the lives of others. As he prepared for the coming day, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The Ravenswoods' dark influence stretched further than he'd anticipated, and they had claimed far too many innocent lives. But now, he had the evidence to bring their legacy to light, to end the cycle of sacrifice and fear that bound Eldermore to the Ravenswoods. Tomorrow, he would confront them publicly, exposing their twisted ritual to the town. But he knew the family wouldn't go down without a fight, and the final battle for Eldermore's soul was just beginning. Theron spent the morning poring over the tome he had stolen from the Ravenswood estate, carefully analyzing every page that detailed the rituals performed by the family over the centuries. The book was a dark testament to the Ravenswoods' obsession with maintaining power through ancient rites. Symbols he had seen on the Ravenswood doors were repeated in the text, each one marking a rite of passage for every sacrificed family member. Among the diagrams, Theron found details about the ascendance ceremony, noting that it required a close familial bond, usually a daughter or sister. Zephyra, he realized, had been intended as that offering, her spirit bound to Eldermore as a guardian under the Ravenswood's control. With evidence of the family's ritual in hand, Theron knew he needed allies. He couldn't confront the Ravenswoods alone, especially with Cassius lurking, eager to protect his family's power. His mind raced, trying to think of who in town would have the courage to help him take on the family. He decided it was time to speak with Idalia Everhart and Leora Blackthorn once more. Theron found Idalia in her garden, tending to a patch of herbs that seemed to thrive despite the fog and gloom that perpetually enveloped Eldermore. She looked up, her sharp eyes narrowing as he approached, the weight of what he'd uncovered visible on his face. "I need your help, Idalia," he said, his tone urgent. "The Ravenswoods are planning another ceremony, a final ritual that will cement their control over this town. We have to stop them." Idalia regarded him with a mixture of skepticism and pity. "And you think a few of us can stand against the Ravenswoods? They have held Eldermore in their grip for centuries." Theron held up the tome. "This book documents every ritual, every sacrifice they've made to keep their power. If we can expose them, show the town what they've done, Maybe we can finally break their hold." She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'll help you, Theron, but be careful. The Ravenswoods have eyes and ears everywhere, and they will stop at nothing to protect their secrets." Together, they went to Leora Blackthorn, who was more than willing to join. Her family, too, had suffered under the Ravenswoods' influence, and she saw this as a chance to seek justice for her brother's disappearance. As they plotted, Theron realized that they needed a public confrontation, a setting where the town could witness the truth firsthand. He suggested the annual Eldermore Harvest Festival, set to take place in 2 days, a gathering where nearly every resident would be present, including the Ravenswoods. That evening, Theron prepared for the confrontation by combing through the tome once more. He meticulously copied key passages, carefully documenting the evidence. He knew the Ravenswoods wouldn't go down without a fight, and he couldn't afford any missteps. His allies, Idalia and Leora, had agreed to spread word among the more resistant townsfolk, warning them to gather by the festival stage early for an important announcement. In a town as small and insular as Eldermore, rumors spread fast, and by dawn, Theron hoped the crowd would be large enough to witness the Ravenswoods' fall. As he packed away his notes, he heard a faint tapping at his window. Peering outside, he spotted a shadow lurking in the fog. The figure remained silent, watching him, then disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. His nerves prickled. The Ravenswoods were watching his every move, aware of his plan to expose them. Theron braced himself for what was to come, knowing the next day would mark a turning point, not only for himself, but for the town and its legacy. The Harvest Festival was a rare break from the somber routine of Eldermore. Stalls selling homemade goods lined the square, music filled the air, and children played games under the watchful eyes of their parents. Yet, beneath the festivities, a tension simmered. Townsfolk glanced over their shoulders, their expressions wary, as whispers circulated about the Ravenswoods and the detective's investigation. Theron, Idalia, and Leora moved among the crowd, spreading word of an announcement to be made at noon on the festival stage. They could feel the eyes of the Ravenswoods upon them, especially Alaric and Cassius, who stood near the edge of the square, their expressions dark and unreadable. At precisely noon, Theron stepped onto the stage, his heart pounding. Idalia and Leora stood behind him, their faces set with grim determination. The crowd fell silent, and Alaric's gaze narrowed as he watched Theron address the gathering. "People of Eldermore," Theron began, his voice carrying across the square. "I came here to investigate the disappearance of Zephyrah Ravenswood. In doing so, I have uncovered dark secrets, truths that have been hidden from you for generations." A murmur rippled through the crowd as he held up the tome, showing them the ancient sinister symbols marking the pages. The Ravenswoods have controlled this town through fear, through rituals that bind their family's power to Eldermore itself. For centuries, they have made sacrifices that have taken the lives of their own daughters, as well as the lives of those who dared to defy them. Cassius stepped forward, his face contorted with fury. "This is absurd. You are poisoning our town with lies, detective." But Theron stood his ground, his voice unwavering. "This tome is proof. It details the Ascended ceremony and every sacrifice your family has made. Zephyrah was intended to be your latest offering, a sacrifice to bind your power once again." The crowd gasped, and murmurs of fear and anger spread. Alaric's face hardened, his voice cutting through the noise. "And what would you suggest, Mr. Locksley? That we abandon the legacy that has protected this town? Without the Ravenswoods, Eldermore would wither. We are the reason this town survives." Leora stepped forward, her voice shaking but firm. "My brother disappeared 5 years ago, and the Ravenswoods claimed it was an accident. But I know now that he, too, was a victim of your protection." Theron looked out over the crowd, seeing the shock and disbelief in their faces. The Ravenswoods are not protectors. They are tyrants. They have used ancient, forbidden magic to keep you under their control. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can end this cycle of fear. At that moment, Alaric stepped forward, his face a mask of cold fury. "Fool," he sneered. "You think you can defy centuries of tradition? The Ravenswoods have always controlled Eldermore. It is our birthright." A few members of the crowd began to shout in agreement with Theron, their voices growing louder as others joined. Alaric's influence was slipping, and he knew it. Cassius, unable to contain his anger, lunged at Theron, attempting to snatch the tome from his hands. But Theron sidestepped, holding it aloft. "This is the end, Ravenswood. Your time is over." Alaric raised his hand, muttering words in a language that Theron didn't understand, and a strange, dark mist began to rise around him, casting an eerie glow over the square. People screamed, backing away in terror. Amid the chaos, Adalia stepped forward, chanting in an ancient dialect, her voice strong and steady. The mist began to dissipate, the dark magic weakening as her words cut through the air. The power Alaric had wielded over the town was crumbling, disintegrating under the force of her counterspell. Cassius howled in frustration, grabbing a dagger from his belt and lunging at Idalia. Theron intercepted him, grappling with Cassius as they struggled on the ground. Cassius fought viciously, determined to protect his family's power, but Theron's resolve was unbreakable. He wrested the dagger from Cassius, pinning him to the ground. At the same moment, Leora held up the tome, chanting the counterspell Adalia had taught her. The symbols on the tome began to glow, burning away the Ravenswood magic, severing the bonds that had held Eldermore under their control for centuries. With a final, piercing scream, Alaric staggered, the dark energy dissipating from his body. His face twisted in pain and fury as he collapsed, his power gone, his legacy shattered. Cassius, subdued and powerless, could only watch in silent rage as the town rose against them. The townsfolk surged forward, united in their resolve to free themselves from the Ravenswood tyranny. As the family's dark hold on Eldermore broke, a weight seemed to lift from the town itself, the fog clearing to reveal a dawn brighter than any the town had seen in generations. The morning sun cut through Eldermore's mist, as though trying to pierce the darkness that had settled over the town for centuries. The streets were quiet, save for whispers and guarded glances exchanged between townsfolk as they processed the events of the previous day. The Ravenswood's control, their dark legacy, had been shattered, yet a sense of unease lingered. Theron sat alone in his room at the Silver Pine, the tome open in front of him. He had thought exposing the Ravenswoods would lift the weight from Eldermore, that unveiling the truth would be enough. But the strange atmosphere felt more like the calm before a storm. He couldn't shake the feeling that something remained, a dark residue from the Ravenswood's legacy that hadn't dissipated with Alaric's downfall. Leora entered, her face pale but resolute. "People are gathering in the square, Theron. They're asking for answers. They're afraid the Ravenswoods might still hold power." He nodded. "I'll speak with them. They need to know that Eldermore can move forward without fear." As he closed the tome, a passage he hadn't noticed before caught his eye. It was hidden in fine script near the bottom of a page. "The bond of the land cannot be broken. It can only be transferred." The words sent a chill down his spine, and he felt a gnawing unease. Perhaps the Ravenswoods' magic wasn't gone, it had merely shifted. Theron stepped onto the makeshift stage in the town square, facing a crowd of uncertain faces. Whispers filled the air, a buzz of fear that hadn't dissipated despite the Ravenswoods' fall. "People of Eldermore," Theron began, "I know you have suffered under the Ravenswoods' power for centuries, but yesterday, we ended their control. We exposed the truth, and now we can finally be free from their influence." A murmur ran through the crowd, but Theron could see the fear still lingering in their eyes. Idalia stepped forward, her voice carrying a note of authority. "The Ravenswood's power over us was real, but it no longer binds us. We have our lives back. This is a new beginning for Eldermore." A voice from the crowd called out, "But what if the curse isn't broken? What if it still holds us?" Theron felt the weight of the townspeople's fear pressing down on him. He wanted to reassure them, to promise that the danger was over. But that passage he had read about the bond being transferred echoed in his mind. He knew he needed to understand what it meant before he could truly set their minds at ease. Theron returned to the Ravenswood estate, where the atmosphere felt heavy, as if the house itself resented his presence. Cassius had been taken by the townspeople, imprisoned in a makeshift cell, but the estate remained untouched, an imposing structure that bore silent witness to centuries of secrets. He searched the house carefully, combing through rooms he hadn't accessed before. After hours of meticulous searching, he found a hidden latch in the library, concealed within an ornate molding. He pressed it, and a section of the bookshelf swung open, revealing a narrow, winding staircase descending into darkness. Torch in hand, he descended, his footsteps echoing as he ventured deeper into the mansion's depths. The air grew colder, heavier, and the walls seemed to close in around him. At the bottom, he found a stone chamber adorned with ancient symbols, faintly glowing as though imbued with a lingering magic. In the center of the room was an altar, and atop it lay a single, dusty journal bound in black leather. The cover bore a familiar symbol, the same symbol that had marked each of the Ravenswood daughters' doors. Theron opened the journal, his fingers trembling. Inside, he found passages written by different Ravenswood family members across generations, each one detailing their part in the Ascendance ceremony. The final entry, written in Alaric's hand, chilled him to the bone. If the family's bond is broken, the curse must seek new blood to bind the land. A vessel unclaimed, a spirit untethered. Theron's heart pounded. The curse wasn't gone, it was waiting. The fall of the Ravenswoods had left Eldermore vulnerable, its dark power needing another to hold it. And now, without a Ravenswood to serve as its vessel, it would seek a new bond. Theron left the chamber, his mind racing as he pieced together the implications of what he'd read. The curse was like a living force, bound to Eldermore and needing a family to wield it. With the Ravenswoods displaced, the curse would search for another family line. Or worse, it would spread its dark influence over the entire town. Adalia and Leora were waiting for him outside the estate, their expressions tense as they saw his troubled face. "What did you find?" Adalia asked. He handed her the journal, watching as her eyes scanned the words, her face growing pale. "It's not over, is it?" she whispered. "No," he replied grimly. "The curse hasn't been broken. It's just been displaced. Eldermore's fate still hangs in the balance." Leora's face hardened. "What can we do?" Theron thought for a moment, weighing his options. The curse was ancient, and the Ravenswoods had woven themselves into it so deeply that even their downfall couldn't sever its hold. He realized that he had two choices: find a way to bind the curse, or allow it to spread unchecked. Theron gathered the townspeople in the square once more, explaining the nature of the curse and the risk that Eldermore still faced. The townspeople listened in horror, realizing that the Ravenswood's influence had been like a dam, holding back a dark flood that now threatened to spill over. "We have two choices," Theron said. "We can attempt to bind the curse once more, find a way to contain it within the Ravenswood estate, or we can leave it unchecked, risking its spread." The townspeople murmured in fear, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. Idalia stepped forward, her face resolute. "We cannot let this darkness spread. If there is a way to bind it, we must try." Theron nodded, feeling the enormity of the task ahead. He would need to perform a binding ritual, one that would contain the curse to the Ravenswood estate and keep Eldermore safe. It would be dangerous, and any mistake could make things worse. With Idalia's help, they gathered the necessary items for the ritual: candles, symbols carved into the earth, protective talismans. The townspeople gathered at the estate, their faces grim as they watched the preparations unfold. As night fell, Theron, Idalia, and Leora gathered in the stone chamber where he had found the journal. The air felt heavy, charged with a strange energy that seemed to pulse through the walls. Each step of the ritual was carefully orchestrated, with Idalia chanting in the ancient dialect that had once bound the curse to the Ravenswoods. Theron stood in the center, clutching a talisman marked with the Ravenswood symbol, the only item strong enough to anchor the curse. He felt the darkness closing in around him, as though the curse were testing his resolve, seeking a way to escape. Suddenly, a chill ran through the room, and a dark mist began to swirl, forming a vague shape that seemed to watch him, waiting. "Do not falter," Idalia warned, her voice steady. "If you lose focus, it will break free." Theron gritted his teeth, focusing his mind on the binding words. He repeated them, feeling the resistance as the curse seemed to fight back, clawing for freedom. The shadows twisted and contorted, writhing as though alive. Finally, with a final word, the mist recoiled, drawn into the talisman in his hand. Theron felt a powerful jolt as the energy surged through him, the weight of the curse bound to the talisman, now rendered inert. The room fell silent. the air clearing as the darkness dissipated. The curse had been contained. The next morning, the townspeople gathered outside the Ravenswood estate, watching as Theron, Idalia, and Leora emerged, exhausted but victorious. The curse was bound, contained within the estate, leaving Eldermore free from its influence for the first time in centuries. As Theron addressed the town, a new sense of hope filled the air. Eldermore is no longer bound to darkness. The Ravenswood's hold is broken, and the curse has been contained. You are free. A murmur of relief spread through the crowd. For the first time in generations, Eldermore was no longer overshadowed by fear, and the townspeople felt the freedom to rebuild, to move forward without the curse that had haunted them. Idalia placed a hand on Theron's shoulder, her voice soft. "You've done what no one else could, Theron. Eldermore will remember you." As Theron prepared to leave, he took one last look at the Ravenswood estate, now a silent monument to the family's dark legacy. He felt a strange mix of triumph and melancholy, knowing he had freed Eldermore, but that the curse would always remain as a reminder. With the town at peace, Theron walked away, leaving Eldermore to its new dawn, finally free from the Ravenswood's shadow.